There is a particular kind of arrogance that does not announce itself with a flourish. It settles in quietly over decades, disguised as confidence, comfortable in the assumption that supply chains exist for the benefit of whoever sits at the center of them. And then one day, a trade dispute exposes what was always underneath, not strength, dependency. What is happening right now between the United States and Canada on the question of agricultural trade is not a story about potatoes. It is a story about how thoroughly and systematically American food infrastructure has come to rely on a neighbor that Washington has spent the better part of 2 years publicly humiliating. And what Mark Carney's government did in response to that pressure was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It simply held firm, declined to accelerate exports on demand, and watched as the arithmetic of dependency did what arithmetic always does. It told the truth. Let me start with what most people actually believe is happening here, because the public narrative on this is almost perfectly inverted from the institutional reality. The story you hear on cable news is the familiar one about leverage and trade weapons. Washington imposes tariffs. Ottawa retaliates. Both sides posture. Eventually, someone blinks. Viewers are asked to think of this as a negotiation between roughly equal parties where the United States, being larger, will inevitably prevail because size equals leverage and leverage equals outcome. That story is comforting, coherent, and almost entirely wrong when applied to agricultural trade between these two countries. The actual situation is considerably more uncomfortable for the American side, and understanding why requires looking at something most political commentary politely ignores: the French fry. I say that without irony because the frozen potato product is one of the clearest illustrations of structural dependency I have encountered in years of watching trade policy. Here are the numbers that the political class has been conspicuously reluctant to discuss. In the 2023 to 2024 production year, Canada exported approximately $2.4 billion in frozen potato products to the United States. That figure had doubled in just 4 years, up from $1.2 billion in 2019 to 2020. 91% of all processing potatoes grown in Canada go south across the border. 93% of Canadian fresh potato exports are destined for American tables. And by some industry estimates, roughly 3 out of every 4 French fries consumed in the United States originated in Canada, processed primarily by 2 New Brunswick-based giants, McCain Foods and Cavendish Farms. McCain Foods alone, according to its own corporate disclosures, produces 1 in every 4 French fries consumed on this planet, not in North America, on this planet. The world's French fry supply runs through Canadian processing facilities at a scale that most American consumers have never had reason to consider. They did not need to. The fries simply appeared. This is what I mean when I talk about invisible dependency. Economies build themselves around stable inputs and then forget the inputs exist. Supply chains become infrastructure. Infrastructure becomes assumption. And assumption, when it meets political disruption, becomes crisis. Washington spent most of 2025 treating Canada as a subordinate trading partner that could be pressured into concessions through tariff threats and rhetorical provocations. What the administration appears not to have gamed through is what happens when the subordinate party holds something the dominant party cannot easily replace. Now let me take you beneath the headlines because this is where the institutional reality diverges sharply from the political narrative. The Trump administration's tariff architecture in 2025 created a specific problem for the North American potato supply chain, and it did so through a combination of blunt instrument policy and institutional miscalculation. When 25% tariffs were threatened on Canadian agricultural goods broadly, the potato sector faced what the Western producer described at the time as an extremely disruptive scenario, even though CUSMA technically exempted compliant products from the harshest rates. The damage was not primarily from tariffs that actually landed. It was from the uncertainty that precedes them. Contract negotiations for the 2025 planting season collapsed. Canadian processors told farmers they needed fewer potatoes before a single tariff had formally taken effect. Planted acreage projections for 2026 dropped. The mechanism by which modern agricultural trade is disrupted is not the tariff itself. It is the planning paralysis that tariff threats create in an industry where you commit land, seed, equipment, and labor 12 months before you know what the policy environment will look like at harvest. I want you to think about what that actually means in operational terms because this is where the human cost of political theater becomes concrete. A potato grower in Alberta or Prince Edward Island does not plant in response to a press conference. They plant in response to contracts. And contracts require counterparties willing to commit to price and volume 12 months out. When the trade environment becomes unpredictable enough that processors cannot make those commitments, farmers face a choice between planting for an uncertain market or reducing production. Most rational actors reduce production. This is not a failure of patriotism or resilience. It is capitalism functioning exactly as designed, rooting around uncertainty toward whatever provides a reliable planning horizon. The Canadian potato sector in 2025 and heading into 2026 was being asked to absorb the costs of instability generated by political decisions made in Washington without being compensated for that risk. It declined to absorb those costs, just as any rational economic actor would. At the same time, something else was happening that received almost no serious coverage in American political media. Farm Credit Canada, the federal crown corporation that finances the agricultural sector, published a detailed analysis in September 2025 identifying $12 billion in Canadian food and beverage exports that could be redirected away from the United States market. $12 billion. That figure covered a broad range of categories, but the analysis paid particular attention to prepared foods, a category that had $8.6 billion in exports in 2023, 90% of which went to the United States. The report was sober, analytical, and methodical in the way government financial institutions tend to be. It identified target markets. It named China, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom as the best candidates for expanded trade. It outlined the mechanisms for making that shift, leveraging existing trade agreements, interprovincial trade, and domestic processing capacity. It was not a press release, it was a strategic document, and what it described was not retaliation, it was adaptation. This is the distinction I want to spend some time on because it cuts to the heart of what Canada's response to American agricultural pressure actually represents at the institutional level. Retaliation is emotional, it is reactive. It says, you hurt me, so I will hurt you back. Adaptation is strategic. It says the risk profile of this relationship has changed, and I am going to reorganize my exposure accordingly. Carney's government and the institutions aligned with it chose adaptation. They did not announce trade wars. They did not stage press conferences about Canadian agricultural sovereignty. They commissioned analyses, identified alternatives, and began the quiet work of reducing dependency in ways that would outlast any single political cycle. That approach does not generate viral clips. It generates structural change, and structural change in trade is far harder to reverse than a tariff rate. I have watched American trade policy for a long time, and one of its persistent institutional failures is what I would describe as the confusion of announcement with achievement. Washington announces a tariff and believes it has reshaped the trade relationship. It has not. It has created a new cost structure that every actor in the supply chain will then spend the following months working around. Companies reroute, producers adjust, buyers find alternatives. The tariff remains on paper while the trade it was meant to govern migrates around it. This is not new. It has happened with steel. It has happened with aluminum. It happened with solar panels, where tariffs intended to revive domestic production largely succeeded in redirecting supply chains through third countries rather than generating American manufacturing investment. The pattern is consistent enough that anyone with institutional memory should be able to predict it. In the agricultural context, the consequences are particularly durable because food supply chains are built on relationships between specific processors, specific farmers, and specific buyers that take years to establish and do not automatically reconstitute when a policy changes direction. Let me give you a concrete illustration of how this plays out. McCain Foods, the Canadian company I mentioned earlier, operates 51 frozen food processing plants around the world. It sources from Manitoba, Alberta, and New Brunswick. It processes primarily in Canada and ships globally. When the American market became volatile, the company did not publicly announce it was pivoting away from the United States. That is not how multinational food processors behave. Instead, the company's logistics and commercial teams quietly began stress testing alternative routes, calculating the economics of redirecting volume to European or Asian customers, and modeling what a reduced American exposure would look like over a 3 to 5 year planning horizon. That analysis happened in boardrooms and spreadsheets, not on television, and it produced decisions that will shape North American French fry supply for years in ways that no tariff announcement will easily undo. When producers of this scale begin building alternative customer relationships, those relationships develop their own inertia. Contracts get signed, logistics infrastructure gets built, expectations get set. The path dependency of trade is real and consequential. Meanwhile, on the American side, the institutional response to this dynamic has been almost perfectly calibrated to accelerate it. The United States filed class action suits in federal court in Illinois against McCain Foods and Cavendish Farms in late 2025, alleging that the two companies had formed what the suits described as a potato cartel, conspiring with other large processors to fix prices. I want to be precise about what I am saying here. I am not in a position to evaluate the legal merits of those suits. That is a matter for the courts. What I am in a position to observe is the institutional signal those suits send to the global supply chain at a moment when Canada's potato processors are already evaluating their American exposure. When your largest customer, which already threatened your industry with 25% tariffs, begins filing cartel suits against your two biggest companies, the business case for deepening your dependence on that customer weakens considerably. This is not about feelings. It is about risk assessment. And the risk calculus for Canadian food processors shipping to the United States looked materially worse at the end of 2025 than it had at the start. Carney's response throughout this period was consistent with the broader pattern his government established in handling American pressure. He did not escalate rhetorically. He did not personalize the dispute or invite the kind of bilateral drama that tends to freeze trade negotiations in amber while both sides perform for their domestic audiences. Instead, his government maintained the legal frameworks that protected CUSMA-compliant exports, authorized the analytical work identifying alternative markets, and positioned Canada as a stable and predictable partner for everyone who was not the United States. That positioning matters in ways that compound over time. When European and Asian buyers are evaluating long-term supply relationships for processed food products, they are not just looking at price and quality, they are looking at supplier reliability. A Canadian processor operating in a coherent policy environment looks more attractive as a long-term partner than an American importer subject to tariff policy that can reverse overnight. Canada's institutional stability was itself a trade tool, deployed quietly and without fanfare, but with durable effect. What this exposes about American food infrastructure should concern anyone who thinks seriously about economic sovereignty. The dependency I described at the outset did not develop because policymakers chose it. It developed because it was efficient. Canadian geography, hydroelectric power, processing infrastructure, and agricultural capacity made it economical to concentrate French fry production in Alberta and New Brunswick and ship south. American fast food chains, grocery retailers, and food service companies built their supply chains around that concentration because it worked. Cost predictability, product consistency, volume reliability, all of it pointed toward Canada. The system functioned without anyone in Washington needing to think about it, and that is precisely the problem. Systems that function without requiring attention tend to generate dependencies that are invisible until they are not. The disruption created by tariff threats in 2025 did not manufacture new American potato processing capacity. That kind of capacity takes years to build. It requires the kind of sustained public and private investment that requires policy stability to attract. Announcing tariffs and then hoping domestic capacity materializes is not an industrial strategy. It is a wish. And the gap between the wish and the reality showed up immediately in grocery store supply chains. The strategic consequences of how this episode unfolded are worth mapping carefully because they will shape the bilateral relationship long after the immediate tariff dispute fades from the news cycle. On the Canadian side, the agricultural sector has received an unmistakable signal that the American market cannot be treated as structurally stable. That signal will influence investment decisions, contract structures, and export strategies for years. Processing plants in Alberta that were built to serve American demand will now be evaluated against a diversification calculus that did not exist 5 years ago. Logistical investments in West Coast port capacity that could redirect frozen potato products to Asian markets become more economically rational when the alternative is indefinite exposure to American policy volatility. These are not speculative scenarios. They are the natural responses of rational economic actors to changed risk environments. They happen without press conferences, and they tend to be durable. On the American side, the institutional damage is less visible, but equally real. Fast food supply chains that were quietly built on Canadian processing capacity now face the possibility that their primary suppliers are restructuring their exposure. Grocery retailers that relied on Canadian frozen potato products as a stable and competitively priced category are looking at a market where that stability has been voluntarily compromised by the government of their own country. American farmers who grow significant quantities of potatoes domestically but lack the processing infrastructure to convert that production into the frozen formats that drive food service demand are caught between a domestic processing sector that cannot scale quickly and an import supply chain that has been deliberately destabilized. None of this benefits the American agricultural worker whose interests the tariff policy claimed to protect. There is also a credibility dimension to this that deserves direct attention. Mark Carney's institutional reputation is built on a specific kind of competence. He governed the Bank of Canada through the financial crisis. He governed the Bank of England through Brexit. Both experiences required managing extreme uncertainty without allowing volatility to cascade into institutional breakdown. His response to American agricultural pressure was consistent with that record. Calm, analytical, non-theatrical, and oriented toward building structural alternatives rather than winning individual news cycles. When he declined to be rushed into concessions, he was drawing on the same instinct that served him in central banking. The instinct that credibility is a long-term asset that gets destroyed by short-term capitulation to pressure. The markets noticed. Canadian agricultural producers noticed. And crucially, the alternative buyers Farm Credit Canada identified in China, Germany, and the Netherlands noticed. Stability in a world where American policy has become conspicuously unstable is a competitive advantage. Carney deployed it methodically. What I keep returning to when I think about this episode is the fundamental confusion at the center of the American approach. Leverage requires dependency, and dependency that you have spent 2 years threatening to penalize is dependency that rational actors will spend 2 years trying to reduce. Every tariff threat, every rhetorical provocation, every cartel lawsuit filed against your primary food supplier sends the same institutional signal to the counterparty. The American market is not a safe long-term commitment. Diversify accordingly. Canada is diversifying accordingly. And the irony embedded in that dynamic is almost too clean for politics. The pressure campaign designed to demonstrate that Canada needs the United States more than the United States needs. Canada is producing exactly the investment and strategic reorientation that will make Canada need the United States less. Not immediately, not completely, but directionally and durably, which is what matters in the long arc of trade relationships. What the potato dispute ultimately reveals is a governing philosophy that consistently mistakes the announcement of strength for the exercise of it. Threatening a 25% tariff on Canadian agricultural goods does not rebuild American food processing capacity. It does not bring French fry plants back to Idaho or Michigan. It does not train the workforce that would operate those facilities. It does not secure the energy supply that would power them. It does not replicate the decades of investment in specialized machinery, processing expertise, and farmer relationships that make Canadian frozen potato production competitive at global scale. What it does is introduce exactly the kind of policy uncertainty that discourages the private investment that would be necessary to do any of those things. And it signals to Canada that the time to build alternatives is now, while the window of reduced American demand makes the political environment at home more conducive to the restructuring that diversification requires. I do not think this story ends with French fries. The logic that applies to frozen potato products applies equally to the $12 billion in broader food and beverage exports that Farm Credit Canada identified as candidates for redirection. It applies to canola, to pulse crops, to processed meats, to maple products, to the prepared foods category where 90% of Canadian export value currently flows south. Each of those categories represents a supply chain where American food infrastructure has built a dependency it has not publicly acknowledged and does not appear to have gamed through before embarking on a tariff strategy that treats all Canadian exports as equally expendable bargaining chips. They are not equally expendable. Some of them are considerably harder to replace than the administration apparently understood when it chose this approach. American power in the 21st century rests significantly on the premise that this country remains an indispensable economic partner. That indispensability is not unlimited. It is not unconditional. It is earned continuously through the kind of reliable and predictable behavior that makes long-term economic commitment rational for partners and suppliers. When that reliability erodes, the erosion does not announce itself. It shows up in supply chain decisions made by private actors responding to incentives, in strategic plans drafted by foreign crown corporations, in contract structures that quietly reduce exposure to American policy risk. History does not punish nations for losing economic power. It punishes them for failing to recognize what they were doing with it until the recognition arrives too late to change course. The French fry is a small thing. What it reveals about institutional dependency, strategic miscalculation, and the compounding costs of mistaking provocation for leverage is considerably larger.